In the dusty streets of Fort Worth, Texas, where cattle drives and railroad money poured in during 1878, stood a saloon that everyone in town whispered about. The Copper Bell was no ordinary bar for cowboys and drifters. It was a place where the desperate swore their long-suffered ailments disappeared overnight. Women claimed headaches that had plagued them since childbirth vanished after a single visit. Families stricken with consumption saw the sickness retreat like fog in the morning sun. Strong men crippled by pain walked out whole again as if nothing had ever been wrong. But on the night of October 15th, 1878, that reputation turned into a nightmare. 12 people died violently inside its walls during a scene that witnesses described as pure hell. The official story never satisfied anyone who truly understood what had taken place. The truth, the part the survivors dared not speak and the town's wealthiest families paid to bury, was that Dr. Cornelius Weatherby was offering more than miracle tonics. He was conducting secret human experiments bankrolled by Eastern pharmaceutical companies that saw frontier towns as perfect testing grounds for compounds too dangerous to try back east. Before we uncover how one man transformed Fort Worth's most beloved gathering place into a laboratory of suffering, let me know in the comments what state or city you're listening from, and be sure to subscribe for more forgotten dark tales from America's past. That fall, Fort Worth was a city straddling two worlds, caught between civilization and the wild frontier that stretched forever west. Reconstruction had ended only 3 years earlier, but the scars of war still lingered in the way old residents eyed northern newcomers with suspicion. It was the perfect soil for secrets to grow. Dr. Weatherby arrived the previous spring, stepping off the Dallas train with only a battered leather bag and a stack of letters from Union Army hospitals. They praised his skill as a surgeon, but left unsaid the battles he had seen or the horrors he had endured. Standing over 6 feet tall with pale blue eyes and temples streaked with gray, he cut an imposing figure in a black frock coat. His hands trembled constantly, a shake he blamed on battlefield surgeries performed under fire, though those who watched him closely suspected something far more unsettling. To a frontier town desperate for medical care, his arrival seemed like salvation. Local physician Marcus Gilland was overwhelmed by the growing population, and Weatherby's credentials promised innovation and modern techniques that Fort Worth's ambitious citizens believed their city deserved. But instead of opening a simple medical office, Weatherby made a move that stunned many, yet thrilled local businessmen. He purchased a 2-story building across from the First National Bank and announced he would open a saloon on the ground floor while keeping his practice in the rooms behind and above. He named it the Copper Bell, marking the entrance with an actual ship's bell of polished copper that rang clear whenever the wind swept down Main Street. Weatherby explained his unusual decision with a kind of logic that impressed Fort Worth's more educated residents. Alcohol, he argued, had medicinal properties, and the warm atmosphere of a saloon could comfort patients better than the cold sterility of an office. People who might never step into a clinic could come in, share their troubles, and receive treatments while enjoying a drink that was itself part of the cure. The Copper Bell's main floor gleamed with refinement rare on the frontier. A mahogany bar imported from New Orleans stretched the length of the room. Brass fixtures glowed against polished wood, and the carpeted floors and wallpaper brought to mind the comforts of St. Louis or New Orleans hotels. Yet, it was the heavy oak door in the back, marked private consultation, that made the Copper Bell different from any other saloon between Dallas and El Paso. Behind that heavy oak door lay a medical facility that would have impressed doctors in Philadelphia or New York, a room lined floor to ceiling with shelves of brown bottles filled with tinctures, powders, and strange liquids that shimmered like captured firelight. A massive desk sat in one corner, its surface cluttered with medical journals, foreign correspondence, and neat stacks of handwritten notes where Dr. Cornelius Weatherby recorded every symptom, treatment, and outcome with obsessive precision. What visitors remembered most, however, was the smell. It was a thick, clinging odor that mixed the sharpness of alcohol with the sweetness of herbs and an unsettling chemical tang that seemed to stick to clothing long after one left the Copper Bell. Some said it reminded them of battlefield hospitals, others of the new chemical works rising in northern cities. Weatherby's methods were unlike anything Fort Worth had ever seen. He studied his patients with unnerving intensity, asking not only about their symptoms, but about their families, habits, emotions, and private fears, all while using instruments so polished and finely made, they looked more suited to a laboratory than a frontier practice. Yet what truly set him apart was how he administered his cures. Weatherby insisted his patients take their treatments immediately in public under his watchful eye. He called these gatherings therapeutic consultations, and they quickly became the talk of North Texas. Each patient received a freshly mixed drink, measured with the precision of a chemist, the results ranging from golden liquids that gleamed like whiskey to green concoctions that seemed to glow with an inner fire. Their effects appeared nothing short of miraculous. A seamstress named Martha Caldwell swore one swallow of his neural tonic erased the crippling headaches she had endured since her husband's death. A cattleman, Samuel Hutchkins, claimed Weatherby's joint elixir returned the mobility he had lost more than a decade earlier. Stories like theirs spread faster than prairie fire. Cowboys left the cattle trails to seek him out. Railroad men scraped together wages for a chance at relief, and even the wives of Fort Worth's most prominent citizens became devoted patients. Soon the Copper Bell was more than a saloon, it was a spectacle. Men and women shuffled in looking broken, only to leave hours later, laughing, brimming with energy, and speaking of new dreams as if their burdens had been erased. By the summer of 1878, people came not just for cures, but for maintenance, insisting they needed Weatherby's tonics to preserve their newfound health. The Copper Bell overflowed with crowds that spilled into the street, turning Maine into something like a carnival, the whole town profiting from the traffic it drew. To manage the throngs, Weatherby hired seasoned bartender Jonas Kurt and two farm girls, Rebecca Howe and Eleanor Finch, who served drinks with practiced hands while watching in fascination as the doctor's remedies performed their wonders before eager eyes. Even as Dr. Weatherby's fame spread across Texas, cracks began to form in the glowing image of the Copper Bell. People who had once walked out of the saloon, cured and full of life, now seemed tethered to it, returning again and again with growing desperation. Families whispered that their loved ones had become irritable and secretive, unable to function unless they had their next appointment. Fort Worth's longtime physician, Dr. Marcus Gilland, noticed something far more troubling. Many of Weatherby's patients displayed signs of dependency worse than anything he had seen in opium users. Their moods swung violently. Their bodies trembled, and when he tried to suggest alternatives, they turned on him with uncharacteristic hostility, insisting only Weatherby understood their suffering. The first public disaster struck in August of 1878. A cattle driver named Pete Garrison collapsed just steps from the Copper Bell after drinking what Weatherby called a pulmonary restorative. Witnesses said Garrison convulsed in the dust, his eyes rolling white, his mouth frothing as his body twisted in grotesque spasms. No ordinary man could survive. He died before Gilland reached him. Weatherby coolly produced a signed note claiming Garrison had a weak heart, and the authorities let the matter rest. But those who saw it knew better. Pete Garrison had been healthy before that final swallow. What unsettled them most was Weatherby himself, who showed no grief at the death, only fascination, carefully jotting notes as if he were studying a laboratory specimen. 2 weeks later, tragedy struck closer to home. Martha Caldwell, the seamstress, once celebrated as Weatherby's greatest success, missed several of her regular visits. Neighbors heard her screams all through the night, raving about spiders crawling beneath her skin, begging for help to claw them free. By morning she was found dead, her arms and face torn by her own hands, her expression frozen in sheer terror. Officials called it nervous exhaustion, but those who saw her body, Gilland among them, knew better. Martha had died in agony, trapped in a waking nightmare. These deaths might have destroyed any other doctor, but Weatherby's reputation remained intact. His living patients still swore by his treatments. His saloon fueled Fort Worth's booming economy, and his most powerful supporters among them, the mayor's own wife, were unwilling to risk the scandal of an investigation. The Copper Bell remained open, louder and busier than ever, even as the atmosphere inside grew more frenzied. Patients demanded larger doses to feel the same relief, and Weatherby began mixing stronger, stranger formulas. Shipments arrived, weekly crates from Chicago, New York, even Europe, stamped as medical supplies, but containing equipment and substances unlike anything the people of Fort Worth had ever seen. October 15th, 1878 began like any other night at the Copper Bell, with familiar faces gathering around the polished mahogany bar and the soft glow of oil lamps casting restless shadows across the room. But by the following dawn, 12 people would lie dead inside Fort Worth's most celebrated saloon, and those who survived would carry memories too horrific to speak aloud. The day had been unseasonably hot, the kind of sticky October heat that clung to clothes and soured tempers, and as evening fell, a wall of black storm clouds rolled in from the west, promising thunder lightning and streets that would soon be rivers of mud. Inside the Copper Bell, Dr. Weatherby moved with an energy that unsettled his staff. His pale blue eyes shone with an intensity that bordered on mania, and he shuttled back and forth from his private consultation room with wooden crates clutched to his chest as though they were more dangerous than dynamite. When bartender Jonas Kurt offered a hand, Weatherby snapped at him to keep away, muttering that tonight would be different, that he had finally perfected a formula that would free his patients from the burden of constant treatments and give them permanent health. Rebecca. How one of the serving girls later recalled that his gaze carried something more than scientific curiosity, something so dark it made her step back whenever his eyes met hers. Eleanor Finch remembered his trembling hands arranging instruments behind the bar, and his lips moving in strange whispers, fragments of English laced with what sounded like Latin prayers or incantations. The first customers arrived just after 6 as the prairie sky growled with thunder. They were not drifters or cowhands, but the most loyal of Weatherby's patients, men and women who swore his remedies had given them back their lives. Harrison Wade, the cattle baron, whose wife praised the doctor's every word. Samuel Hutchkins, once crippled by arthritis and now walking tall. Martha Ellsworth, the widowed banker's wife, who claimed Weatherby had cured her of the same consumption that had taken her husband and children. By 7, the Copper Bell was packed tighter than anyone could remember, filled with people who had traveled from Dallas-Waco and beyond, all eager to be part of what they believed was the dawn of a new age in medicine. Lightning cracked against the windows as the storm bore down, and anticipation inside the saloon swelled to a fever pitch. This was no ordinary crowd. It was a gathering of Fort Worth's most respectable citizens, men of influence and women of society, all waiting for Weatherby's promised cure, unaware they were stepping into a night that history would remember only in whispers. Mayor William Crawford sat in the corner with railroad executive Thomas Benedict and merchant James Fairfax, their presence lending the night an air of civic approval. Even Dr. Marcus Gilland, Weatherby's rival, had come curiosity overcoming caution as he claimed he wanted to see firsthand what his colleague was calling a medical revolution. Outside, the storm broke in full-force wind, clawing at the shutters while rain hammered the windows like fists. Inside, Dr. Weatherby stood before the crowd with an unusual air of ceremony. Instead of preparing custom doses as he always had, he announced that tonight would be different. Every man and woman present, he declared, would share the same treatment together, a community therapeutic intervention that would harness what he called sympathetic resonance. The idea that the group's shared experience would amplify the cure. The words sounded impressive, scientific, and most of those listening nodded along, eager to believe they were part of something historic. Weatherby moved behind the bar with his usual precision, but those watching closely noticed things were not the same. Gone were the familiar brown bottles of tinctures. From the wooden crates he had guarded all day, he produced crystalline substances that glittered like ground diamonds under the lamplight, and powders that released sharp, acrid fumes the moment they touched the damp air. One in particular caught the eye of several observers, a shifting crystalline powder that seemed alive, changing from blue to green to an oily rainbow sheen that made the eyes ache to look at. When Weatherby poured it into his mixing vessel, it hissed softly and released curling vapors that made nearby patrons instinctively step back. No one dared question him. "Ladies and gentlemen," Weatherby declared as lightning flashed and thunder rattled the walls, "what you are about to experience is the pinnacle of years of research. A fusion of ancient knowledge and the most advanced discoveries of modern science. Tonight, you will witness the future of medicine, not just for Fort Worth, not just for Texas, but for the civilized world." The drinks he poured were nothing like his earlier tonics. The liquid was thick, almost oily, shifting between blue and green as if it had its own pulse. Its sharp chemical odor carried an undertone of sweetness, like fruit gone rotten in the sun. A few patrons wrinkled their noses or hesitated, but Weatherby's commanding presence, the hopeful cheers of loyal patience, and the weight of social expectation pushed them forward. At the doctor's signal, 60 glasses were raised. "To health and prosperity," he proclaimed. The crowd echoed him, voices uniting in what would be the last moment of normalcy inside the copper bell. The effects came fast. Within minutes, the saloon erupted into chaos, disguised at first as revelry. Some patrons burst into uncontrollable laughter, howling until tears streamed down their cheeks and their lungs strained for air. Others fell into strange trances, staring at the wooden grain of the tables, the shifting lamp shadows, or their own hands, as if they were gazing upon wonders never before seen. What began as odd but harmless behavior soon spiraled into nightmare. Mayor William Crawford, seated proudly in the corner, launched into a feverish monologue about Fort Worth's glorious future, his words tumbling incoherently from railroads to politics to visions of golden cities, his glassy eyes staring past the crowd as though no one else existed. Harrison Wade. The cattle baron grew convinced that the room was filled with conspirators plotting to steal his land. His accusations flew at strangers and friends alike, his voice rising into furious roars as paranoia consumed him. Outside, the storm reached its peak, thunder shaking the walls, lightning flooding the saloon in blinding flashes of white, while inside chaos took hold. Samuel Hutchkins, once the poster child of Weatherby's cures, shrieked that insects were crawling beneath his skin. He tore at his flesh with bloody fingernails, raking his arms and face in a frenzy to rid himself of parasites no one else could see. Martha Ellsworth, the banker's widow, began wailing that the walls were closing in. Her terror drove her headlong into the windows, smashing glass and slicing her arms, yet she hurled herself again and again at invisible threats as her screams rose to a pitch that barely sounded human. Dr. Gilland, who had swallowed only a cautious sip of Weatherby's formula, struggled to intervene. His training told him what he was seeing was madness, but even he felt his thoughts slip, his reason clouded by the same poison coursing through the others. He tried to calm patients to render aid, but his words came slurred. His hands unsteady, his mind betraying him as chemicals gnawed at his clarity. The storm outside roared, but it could not drown the nightmare within. Shattering glass, the crash of overturned tables, the guttural screams of men and women lost to delirium, filled the copper bell like the sounds of hell itself. Long-respected citizens turned on one another, their minds twisted by hallucination and fear. Thomas Benedict, the railroad executive, seized a broken bottle and lunged at his old associate James Fairfax, accusing him of stealing his thoughts. The two men grappled savagely across the floor, blood spraying, as others either fled or cheered them on in manic delight. Harrison Wade found a surgeon's bone saw among Weatherby's instruments and began swinging wildly, convinced he was beset by cattle thieves. His blade carved flesh indiscriminately, and the sight of blood seemed to unchain something primal in the room. Men who had never raised a hand in violence became beasts, smashing bottles into skulls, clawing with bare hands, while women shrieked and clawed at phantoms only they could see. Behind the bar, Jonas Kurt, the seasoned bartender, clutched Rebecca Howe and Eleanor Finch close as they huddled in terror, watching Fort Worth's finest citizens devolve into raving murderers. Kurt had seen plenty of brawls in rough saloons, but nothing could have prepared him for the horror unfolding before his eyes. The Copper Bell had become a slaughterhouse of madness. The blood streaming from Martha Ellsworth's wounds was only one thread in the nightmare tapestry that had consumed what was once Fort Worth's most refined establishment. Dr. Weatherby himself had vanished early in the chaos, retreating behind the oak door of his consultation room. When Jonas Kurt pounded on it begging for help, the doctor refused to emerge. From inside came the sound of shuffling, the scratch of hurried writing, and bursts of manic laughter, broken by muttered notes that sounded less like prayers and more like the cold observations of a scientist watching an experiment unfold. The violence raged for what seemed like hours. In truth, it lasted little more than 2, though time bent and fractured for those trapped inside. As the storm outside waned, and the first gray hints of dawn touched the horizon, the frenzy within the Copper Bell finally subsided. Not because sanity had returned, but because bodies could no longer sustain the madness. Some patrons collapsed where they stood, poisoned and spent. Others bled out where they had fallen, their lifeblood soaking into carpets that had once given the saloon its air of refinement. The survivors sat in stunned silence, hollow-eyed and unblinking their expressions, those of souls who had seen hell and barely returned. When daylight broke on October 16, 1878, the Copper Bell no longer resembled a place of healing or even a saloon. It looked like a battlefield. 12 lay dead among shattered chairs, broken bottles and scarlet pools that stained the New Orleans carpeting beyond repair. Another 8 survived with wounds so grave that weeks of care would not erase the scars, and none would ever escape the psychological ruin that Weatherby's formula had carved into their minds. Constable Robert Hayes and Sheriff Daniel Murphy arrived within hours, hardened men who had faced outlaws and bloodshed, but stood shaken at the carnage inside Fort Worth's proudest establishment. Their official inquiry was swift, almost indecently so, and the story that emerged was a diluted version of reality stripped of its horror to preserve the town's fragile reputation. The Copper Bell, once a hub of prosperity and promise, stood boarded and chained on Main Street, a monument to collective shame. And as for Dr. Cornelius Weatherby, the man whose hands had mixed the poison that destroyed his community, he faced no lasting consequence. Cleared by the investigation, he abandoned the Copper Bell without ceremony and withdrew to a modest house on the town's edge, a property he had purchased months earlier, as if he had always known this day would come. When neighbors approached, he spoke vaguely of letters from Eastern institutions of research that might soon call him away from Texas. But to those who had seen what happened inside the Copper Bell, it was clear enough Weatherby had not been a healer at all, but a man who turned Fort Worth into his laboratory and left it scarred forever. The survivors of that October night were never the same. Instead of healing, they seemed to wither, their minds and bodies unraveling as if the poison Weatherby had fed them still crept through their veins long after the Copper Bell's doors were chained shut. Samuel Hutchkins, once the cattleman whose recovery had been held up as proof of the doctor's genius, began suffering violent seizures that left him thrashing on the floor, muttering about insects burrowing beneath his skin and pleading with invisible tormentors. His wife, at first convinced it was trauma from the massacre, slowly came to understand it was something deeper damage done not just to his mind, but to his very nerves. Martha Ellsworth, the banker's widow, whose desperate flight through shattering windows had left her scarred, slipped into permanent madness. She spent her days measuring the walls of her home, convinced they were closing in on her, filling notebooks with frantic calculations that charted a world shrinking around her. Mayor William Crawford emerged bloodied, but politically stronger. His scars and broken arm made him look like another victim, and his voice carried weight when he insisted that the city must move on. He used his position to quash inquiries, arguing that lingering on the tragedy would only scare off investors and settlers. Business leaders eager to protect Fort Worth's future backed him fully. The families of the 12 dead were left with grief poisoned by confusion. How could they mourn properly when the official explanation tainted liquor driving respectable men and women to insanity? Rang so hollow their loved ones had not been drunkards or brawlers, and no one who had seen the carnage could believe cheap whiskey alone was to blame. Some families hired investigators to pry deeper, but nothing concrete ever surfaced. Leads dissolved, witnesses grew silent, and the unspoken pressure to leave the Copper Bell tragedy smothered any hope of resolution. Dr. Marcus Gilland, who had sipped only enough of Weatherby's concoction to keep his wits about him, found his credibility compromised. He knew what he had seen was not alcohol's work, but the poison had clouded his own memory, leaving him unable to testify with authority. He could only admit that something extraordinary had happened, something beyond rational explanation. As for those who had worked inside the Copper Bell, Jonas Kurt, and the serving girls Rebecca Howe and Eleanor Finch, they became reluctant celebrities. Reporters, gawkers, and investigators hounded them for their accounts. And though the details blurred with retellings, the heart of their stories never wavered. Weatherby had unveiled a new formula that night, made from substances they had never seen, and what followed was madness beyond human comprehension. As the months dragged on, the testimony of the Copper Bell survivors began to unravel. Rebecca Howe admitted that her memories of Weatherby's final preparations had grown hazy, blaming trauma for her inability to recall the substances with precision. Eleanor Finch developed a severe stutter that made recounting the events unbearable. Eventually, she refused to speak of that night at all, her family pleading with the town to let her forget. Jonas Kurt remained the most consistent witness, but his reputation as a drinker and his dependence on future employment left his credibility in ruins. When he attempted to record his memories in writing, Fort Worth's business elite made it clear such a document would be unwelcome and dangerous for his prospects. By the winter of 1878, disturbing patterns began to emerge. Survivors and their families reported nightmares that were eerily alike despite no contact between them. Dreams of Weatherby's pale blue eyes, staring from shifting shadows of insects crawling beneath skin in strange patterns that hinted at words of 12 voices screaming in unison as walls pressed inward like jaws. The dreams were so vivid that many survivors dreaded sleep deteriorating further from exhaustion. Stranger still symptoms spread beyond those who had been inside the Copper Bell. Martha Ellsworth's sister, who lived in Dallas and had not set foot in Fort Worth in over a year, suddenly tore at her own skin as if plagued by the same phantom insects. Samuel Hutchins's eldest son, away on cattle drives during the massacre, began suffering terrifying blackouts on his return, finding himself miles from home with no memory of the work he had performed during lost hours. These were not ordinary cases of trauma. Gillen, desperate for answers, discreetly consulted colleagues in Dallas, Houston, and New Orleans, describing the symptoms without naming their cause. The responses were always the same: confusion, disbelief, and no explanation grounded in known medicine. It was as if the horror of the copper bell had become contagious, spreading like an unseen plague. Yet as spring of 1879 approached, Fort Worth's leaders shifted their focus. Determined to bury the past, they turned their energy to restoring the city's reputation, attracting new settlers and investors, and presenting an image of resilience. For them, the copper bell was not a tragedy to solve, it was a stain to be erased. The copper bell did not remain empty for long. A group of local investors purchased the property, announcing plans to transform the saloon into a modern general store that would symbolize Fort Worth's resilience and forward-looking spirit. Newspapers celebrated the project with glowing headlines, and Mayor Crawford himself broke ground, with a silver-plated shovel smiling for photographers as if the memory of October 15th had already been buried. But the building resisted its new purpose. Workers reported sudden waves of nausea and disorientation in certain rooms, particularly the former consultation chamber, where Weatherby had prepared his last and deadliest formula. Some swore they heard footsteps in empty halls, voices murmuring from nowhere. A few men, seasoned carpenters who had built half the town, walked off the job and never returned. Renovation dragged on with costly delays, and when the general store finally opened, it fared little better. Shoppers avoided it without knowing why. Even strangers from out of town, ignorant of the building's history, described a suffocating unease when they stepped through the door, as if the walls themselves remembered the massacre. At the same time, Dr. Weatherby grew more reclusive and his behavior more troubling. Neighbors whispered about seeing him in his garden in the hours before dawn, burying parcels by lantern light and marking their resting places with neat arrangements of stones that seemed to follow some private code. Sharp chemical odors drifted from his property, mingled with the sickly stench of decay, enough to spook livestock and send dogs whining from the fences. When complaints reached the authorities, the public was told the doctor was conducting legitimate scientific work requiring privacy. Meanwhile, his correspondence with Eastern institutions intensified. Packages arrived at the depot almost weekly, addressed to him under false names, filled with crystalline powders that shimmered with unnatural hues, dried plants that made handlers sneeze uncontrollably, and volatile chemicals that hissed or flared when exposed to the Texas humidity. Those who pressed him about his future found a man slipping deeper into obsession. Weatherby spoke only of research, insisting the Copper Bell massacre had provided invaluable data that would transform medicine across the civilized world. He showed no remorse, no acknowledgement of the lives lost, only a cold conviction that the blood spilled in Fort Worth was a necessary sacrifice in the pursuit of progress. When confronted about the 12 who had died and the 8 left permanently damaged, Dr. Weatherby showed no hint of remorse. His reply was cold clinical. He insisted the victims had made voluntary contributions to scientific progress, their suffering a necessary step toward treatments that would one day save thousands. His pale eyes burned with unsettling conviction, and his trembling hands only seemed to emphasize his fanatic intensity. To Weatherby, he was not a criminal or a reckless physician. He was a visionary, misunderstood by small minds, and temporarily hindered by the town's fear. He spoke of his work as though it were destiny too vital to stop. Then, in the bitter winter of 1879, a new figure arrived in Fort Worth and quietly shifted the story of the Copper Bell forever. Margaret Henley stepped off the Chicago train with a worn leather satchel and the determination of someone who had carried grief into action. Her younger brother, James Fairfax, the respected merchant killed in the Copper Bell massacre, had been written off as a man who drank too deeply and died in a brawl. Margaret knew better. Fairfax had been temperate, disciplined, and utterly averse to drunken quarrels. The official explanation contradicted everything about his life. Unlike the other grieving families who eventually yielded to silence, Margaret had the skills and the means to fight back. As a telegraph operator for Western Union, she commanded a network that spanned the nation. She could exchange information with sources in distant cities, track shipping records, and piece together communications that local authorities never saw. Methodically, she gathered correspondence invoices and financial ledgers until a darker truth emerged. Weatherby had not been ordering ordinary medical supplies. Over 18 months, he had purchased rare and dangerous materials in staggering quantities. Industrial solvents with no therapeutic use, experimental compounds confined to laboratory research, and plant extracts better known for their use in poisons than in healing tonics. The cost of these shipments exceeded $15,000 more than most frontier doctors would earn in a decade. This was not the behavior of a small-town physician. It was the profile of a man backed by money and power. A man treating Fort Worth not as a community, but as a laboratory. Margaret's investigation revealed that Weatherby's ties to pharmaceutical companies ran far deeper than bulk orders of strange chemicals. Through colleagues in the telegraph industry, she obtained copies of coded messages showing that the doctor had been sending detailed reports on his patients' reactions to experimental treatments. Those reports were being bought by Eastern firms for handsome sums. Records showed that Hammond Chemical Works of New York and Brennan Medical Supplies of Chicago had paid Weatherby more than $3,000. In the year before the massacre, payments disguised as compensation for frontier research. But in truth, buying human data that no city hospital could have legally provided. To the companies, towns like Fort Worth were convenient laboratories, places to test substances too dangerous to unleash on respectable populations. Her arrival in Fort Worth unsettled the very men who had worked hardest to bury the Copper Bell's legacy. When she asked for her brother's belongings and access to the investigation files, she was met with stalling tactics and polite refusals. Mayor Crawford personally visited her at the Grand Central Hotel, offering condolences while warning that reopening old wounds would harm the town's recovery. But Margaret pressed harder, producing documents that contradicted the official story. The mayor then arranged a meeting with Sheriff Murphy, who handed her a carefully edited version of the investigation that scrubbed any mention of Weatherby's special preparations or the bizarre symptoms witnessed that night. Margaret saw through the deception. Her years in telegraph work had trained her to spot patterns and omissions, and she realized at once that officials were not merely reluctant, they were actively covering up the truth. Unlike other grieving relatives, she was too skilled, too determined, and too financially secure to be silenced or bought off. That made her dangerous. One of her most crucial encounters came with Dr. Marcus Gilland, the only physician who had survived the massacre with his mind largely intact. When Margaret placed the evidence across his desk, telegrams, receipts, shipping manifests, he could not deny what he saw. The chemicals Weatherby ordered had no place in legitimate medicine. They were laboratory toxins, experimental compounds, even known poisons. Margaret's voice was steady as she laid out her conclusion. My brother was not a violent man. He would never drink himself into madness or start a fight. Something was done to him, done to all of them. Fort Worth was a testing ground. Your patients were subjects. Gilland sat in silence, stricken. Her argument was persuasive, but its implications were staggering. If she was right, then he and the other survivors had not simply witnessed a tragic accident. They had been deliberately poisoned. The seizures, hallucinations, and lingering symptoms he observed were not trauma, but the continuing effects of chemicals that had no business in human bodies. It meant his town, his patients, and even his own judgment had been exploited in the name of progress. Margaret's discoveries pointed to something far more sinister than a single night of horror in Fort Worth. If pharmaceutical companies were paying doctors like Weatherby to conduct secret human experiments, then frontier towns across the West could be serving as laboratories, their isolation and lack of oversight, making them perfect for tests no city would ever allow. Fort Worth was not an anomaly, it was a warning. The confrontation that would decide the fate of Weatherby's work came sooner than anyone expected. On the morning of March 10, 1880, 18 months to the day after the massacre, Eleanor Finch appeared at Margaret's hotel room, pale and trembling. She confessed that one of Weatherby's new assistants, a young man claiming to be a medical student, had offered her generous pay to return as a server at a special event during the upcoming Cattlemen's Association gathering. The instructions she received were chillingly specific, detailing the timing and serving of drinks that could only be part of another mass experiment. Margaret and Dr. Gilland immediately grasped the danger. The gathering would bring together more than 50 of Texas's wealthiest ranchers and most influential businessmen, men who controlled vast fortunes and wielded enormous political power. If Weatherby succeeded, the devastation could ripple far beyond Fort Worth, shaping decisions that would affect the future of the entire state. Through intercepted correspondence obtained by Margaret's network of telegraph contacts, they confirmed what they had feared. Weatherby was not acting alone. He was part of a coordinated effort, a network of frontier doctors and researchers quietly funded by Eastern pharmaceutical companies to test compounds on unsuspecting populations. The Cattlemen's event was intended as proof of concept, an experiment that, if successful, would expand the program into other territories. On March 15th, as the cattlemen gathered beneath the storm lanterns of Fort Worth's Grand Hall, Margaret and Dr. Gilland made their stand. They warned as many as they could, exposing Weatherby's ties to the companies and the evidence of what had happened at the Copper Bell. Some listened unnerved and slipped away before the night began. But Weatherby had anticipated interference. His contingency plan was already in place. With cold clinical certainty, he revealed his final truth. Fort Worth itself had been his laboratory all along. For months, he had been seeding the town's water supply with experimental compounds, tracking the subtle changes in health behavior and even dreams among its citizens. The seizures, the hallucinations, the skin-crawling visions reported by survivors and their families were no lingering trauma. They were the symptoms of an ongoing experiment that none of them had ever consented to. Margaret's bravery stopped the Cattlemen's massacre before it began. But the cost was her life. Within days, she was discovered dead in her hotel room, the authorities calling it suicide despite evidence that pointed to murder. Gilland, the only surviving physician who might have supported her findings, collapsed into madness soon after and was committed to an asylum in Austin, where he died 3 months later. Weatherby vanished from Fort Worth in the wake of Margaret's death, leaving behind his laboratory and meticulous notes records that revealed the Copper Bell was only one chapter in a series of experiments carried out in scattered frontier towns across the West. The companies that had financed his work erased their tracks with ease, their names scrubbed from files as though they had never been involved. In the summer of 1880, the Copper Bell was torn down, but the ground where it stood remained lifeless, barren for decades. Locals whispered that on still nights you could hear echoes of screams, remnants of that October evening when progress turned to horror. Fort Worth grew and prospered, rising into one of Texas's great cities, but its foundation carried a stain invisible to newcomers. Those who had seen the truth understood that the city's prosperity had been purchased through systematic human experimentation, the quiet theft of free will in the name of science. The cattlemen who had unknowingly ingested Weatherby's compounds went on to make decisions that shaped the future of Texas, never certain whether their choices were truly their own or the result of unseen chemical influence. And that is the real horror, the kind that hides behind respectability, speaking in the language of improvement and progress, while stripping away everything that makes us human. Thank you all very much for watching my video until the end. I sincerely appreciate it, and I look forward to seeing you in the next video.